Our distinguished speaker tonight, Robert Freedman, teaches at Johns Hopkins. He is a renowned expert on Israel and on Russia, and tonight he'll speak on both. It's a good occasion. Just 2 months ago, Israel celebrated its 75th anniversary. But over those 75 years, Russia has played a variety of roles in dealing with Israel. It has provided military and diplomatic support to Israel's enemies. Well, first of all, it helped in Israel's fight for independence, especially getting rid of the British. But it's also provided military and diplomatic support to Israel's enemies over these past 75 years. It's given direct aid and indirect aid to terror groups that attacked Israel. Yet Israel has often taken the Russian side in international disputes, or it's chosen to sit on the fence. Despite the pleading of Volodymyr Zelensky, Israel has shown no sign of supplying the Iron Dome anti-missile shield to Ukraine. Clearly, Israel has its reasons. Professor Freedman's view on Israel is that it acts as the junior partner in what appears to be a one-sided relationship that's chiefly benefited Russia. The question is why? And can anybody trust Russia, whose relationship with Israel has been so ambivalent throughout those 75 years? Professor Freedman is well equipped to speak on this subject. This, by the way, is his fifth presentation to the Baltimore Council. He received his bachelor's degree in diplomatic history from the University of Pennsylvania, his MA and his Ph.D. degrees in international relations from Columbia. His thesis advisor at Columbia was none other than Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski. He just told me that his thesis was on economic warfare in the communist bloc. Those were the good old days. He has been an assistant professor of Russian history at the U.S. Military Academy, associate professor of political science and Russian at Marquette University, and a professor of political science at the Baltimore Hebrew University, including a tenure as president of the institution. He is well known to members for his previous presentations. We in the Baltimore Council are very lucky to have him as a trustee of the council. Over to you, Professor Freedman.
Thank you very much, Roy, for the warm introduction. And let me add my personal thanks to you for your leadership in the council. It is very, very much appreciated. Well, tonight we have an interesting challenge. When you deal with international relations and relations between two countries, usually economics and security issues tend to be the most important ones. However, in the Israeli-Russian, or before that, the Israeli-Soviet relationship, there was another factor. And that factor sometimes people overlook was the role of Soviet and then Russian Jews. The idea from the Israeli side was the ethos of Zionism, or Jewish nationalism, was to ingather as many Jews as possible for the Jewish state. That's always been an issue between Russia and Israel, perhaps never more so than in Putin's time today. Okay, let's begin at the beginning. When the communists seized power, and even before that, they were virulently opposed to Zionism, i.e. Jewish nationalism, the desire for a Jewish state. Why? Because the communists felt this diverted the workmen, the working class, from the class struggle against the capitalists. Thus, it was a huge surprise in 1947 when all of a sudden the Soviet Union came out for an independent Jewish state. If you remember, the UN made the decision to divide the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Not only did they do that politically at the UN, but they saw via Czechoslovakia, which was one of their client states after the February 1948 coup, that important arms flowed to the new state of Israel machine guns, heavy weapons, and planes that helped turn the tide of victory for the nascent Jewish state. And of course, the question is why? Well, I was fascinated early in my career precisely with this question, given the long history of Soviet anti-Zionism, to find out why, in fact, the USSR helped Israel. So I went to the Zionist archives in Jerusalem, hoping to find some information on this. I came armed with 4 different hypotheses, and during the Q&A, I'd be happy to discuss them more. And the idea was why? Well, it turns out I found one document, which was a memorandum of a conversation between a representative of the Jewish Agency, which was the leading Zionist body at the pre-state time, and a Russian diplomat at the Syrian embassy in 1947. And what the Russian diplomat or Soviet diplomat said at the time was, "We will support you if you promise not to give military bases to either the United States or to Britain." Why? At the end of World War II, the British were trying to build up a bloc of pro-Arab, pro-British states in the Middle East, in which there was no room for a Jewish state, and I should mention no room for any French influence either, as the British were trying to create their sphere of influence in the region. If you remember, besides the atom bomb, the most important technological development in World War II was the long-range bomber. And the Soviets were very worried that, stationed in Arab countries near the Soviet Union, the West could bomb their oil fields in Baku and reach deep into the Soviet Union with B-29s or the equivalent. So that was the deal. And the deal was no bases to the British, no bases to the Americans, and we will support you. And they did. Well, how did it all go sour? Issue number 2, Soviet Jews. The first Israeli ambassador to Moscow was Golda Meir. Some of you remember her later on as prime minister. And she visited in September of 1948 the main synagogue in Moscow, and suddenly 50,000 Jews appeared, embracing her. Stalin, already paranoid at the time, worried about the loyalty of these Jews and began to crack down hard on the Soviet Jewish community, to the point that by 1952, a number of Jewish intellectuals were murdered by Stalin. And in early 1953, there was something called the Doctors' Plot, where a group of doctors, mostly Jewish, were accused of poisoning Soviet government officials. There was a great fear of a huge pogrom against the Jews, or at least a deportation of the Jews to Central Asia at the time. And bump, relations were broken between Israel and the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin died, fortunately, a few months later. The Doctors' Plot was revealed to be a hoax, and relations were restored. Nonetheless, when Khrushchev took over consolidated power in 1955, the Soviets chose to go the Arab route. You may remember the September 1955 arms deal with Egypt, followed by an arms deal with Syria, and then after the Iraqi Revolution of 1958, Soviet arms also went to Iraq. Now, these are enemies of Israel. The Israelis were very, very concerned, especially when the Egyptians started pouring arms into the Sinai Desert right along the border of Israel. This is one of the reasons why Israel joined together with the British and the French in this tripartite invasion of Egypt in 1956. Now, the Soviets at the time, and Khrushchev had his hands full with the Hungarian Revolution, as you might remember, but he still managed to issue warnings against Israel and against the British and the French. Okay, following that, a very interesting thing happened. Gomulka takes power in Poland, and the Soviets allow some Jews of Polish origin who'd been in the Soviet Union to leave. Many of them went on to Israel. Some of them went to Poland to meet an unpleasant fate in 1968, but that's another story. Following this, the Soviets continued to arm the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Iraqis until Khrushchev was overthrown himself in 1964. Now, Brezhnev, when he took over in 64, continued the same policy. But he also took advantage, or tried to take advantage, of the fact the United States was bogged down, remember, in Vietnam in 1965. Chinese were bogged down in the Cultural Revolution in 1966. So they saw real opportunity to make headway in the Middle East. And they came up with this doctrine of anti-imperialist Arab unity, which means against Israel as the spearhead of imperialism in the Middle East, and of course, against the United States. Now, we don't have time to go into the origins of the Six-Day War in 1967, but the Soviets certainly made their contribution to it by falsely telling the Egyptians that Israel was about to attack Syria. The end result of this was defeat for Soviet client Egypt, defeat for Soviet client Syria. Now, this had a very interesting effect internally in Russia, and that is all of a sudden 3 generations of sleeping Jews in the Soviet Union woke up and became more nationalistic. And the interesting term that I learned when I visited the Soviet Union soon afterwards was the old Soviet or Russian cliche, which was beat the Jews, was suddenly transformed into beat them like the Jews do, and referring to what happened in the Six-Day War. In any case, the only thing that Moscow did was break diplomatic relations with Israel, but no intervention in the war. However, following the war, the Soviets rebuilt the Egyptian Air Force and helped the Egyptians as they tried to move surface-to-air missiles up to the canal. The Israelis tried to stop this and wound up bombing deep into Egypt to hurt the Egyptian war effort, to hit their military-industrial complex. Egypt got desperate. It called on the Soviets for help. The Soviets then supplied pilots and surface-to-air missiles. And in July of 1970, it's a very sticky situation whereby Israeli pilots engaged Soviet pilots, albeit in Egyptian uniforms, in combat over the Suez Canal, shooting down 5 of the Soviet planes. Now, it could be, as we see later on, one of the reasons why the Soviets tolerated Israeli airstrikes in Syria after 2015 was they have memories of just how good the Israeli pilots were. In any case, it was a very sticky situation. U.S. Secretary of State Rogers was able to work out a ceasefire, but a few years later came the Yom Kippur War. Russians supplied arms to Egypt and Syria. The U.S. supplied arms to Israel, and then Israel turned the tide. You all know what happened in the war. Soviets threatened to intervene, but didn't. The Soviets then really, not having broken diplomatic relations with Israel, couldn't talk to both sides of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So they concentrated on attacking Israel when and where possible, including in the UN, where they played a big role in the Zionism is Racism declaration in 1975. However, following this, Brezhnev got sicker and sicker and sicker and weaker. And when the Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982 to get rid of the state within the state that the Palestine Liberation Organization had set up there, the Russians did essentially nothing. It was the United States who helped bring that conflict to an end. Now, what I found absolutely interesting during this whole period was when Brezhnev had no love at all for Soviet Jews. He was piloting this concept of West German revanchism, Zionism, American imperialism, they're everybody's enemies. And Soviet Jews were, singled out as part of this anti-Zionism. You can't really separate in my view, then or now, anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. However, after the Israelis won the war in '67, and after the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, you had a push-pull phenomenon. That is, the Israelis, by their victory, began to attract Soviet Jews, while Soviet Jews essentially were pushed out of the Soviet Union, having no hope for any real, genuine reform, as some had hoped for, in the USSR. So you had the beginnings of a rather serious movement to help Soviet Jews. Now, why did Brezhnev wind up helping Soviet Jews to emigrate? He had no love for them. Well, there was a new phenomenon on the world scene. Communist China and the Soviet Union had become enemies. And you all remember that under Nixon, there was a rapprochement between the United States and China, which is sort of the worst nightmare that the Soviets had. At the same time, the events in Poland in 1970, with the riots there, wound up kicking Gomulka out finally. It could happen in the USSR, so there's a feeling you needed trade. And the third issue was strategic arms. The U.S. economy being more than 3 times the size of that of the Soviet Union, the U.S. could, if it had the will, spend much more on defense, and the Soviets couldn't keep up. So the idea was to reach a strategic arms limitation agreement. So these 3 factors, fear of a U.S.-Chinese alignment, desire for a strategic arms agreement, and desire for a trade agreement came together. And of course, how do the Soviets pay for this? A Soviet colleague of mine who also did international relations and what I do, Soviets in the Middle East, at the time told me that Soviet Jews had become, if you know the Russian word, valuta, which means foreign exchange. The deal was, you improve relations with the Soviet Union, we let the Soviet Jews out. And in fact, that's what happened, 71, 72, 73, as a new strategic arms agreement was signed, a trade agreement was signed under Mr. Nixon, and the image of a U.S.-Chinese alignment still loomed large. Okay, what happened there? Well, unfortunately, the Soviets took the side of the Arabs, as I mentioned, in the Yom Kippur War, urged the Arabs on their oil embargo in the United States. This undercut détente very much in the United States. And support for the trade agreement began to evaporate. It had not yet been ratified by the Senate. So at the time, one of the senators, Mr. Stevenson from Illinois, added to the trade agreement a limit of $300 million that the U.S. could invest in the USSR. The Soviets were hoping for $20 billion in U.S. investments. Trade agreement died. With that, the number of Soviet Jews allowed to leave the USSR plummeted from over 35,000 in 1973 down to about 11 or 12,000, 74, 75, and 76. But then in comes Jimmy Carter, right? Jimmy Carter. Life is devoted to reaching a strategic arms agreement with the USSR. As you may remember, in order to get it, he unilaterally cancels the B-1 bomber, the neutron bomb, sort of leaning over backwards to reach an agreement with the USSR. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong has died. There's a new rapprochement between the United States and China. And of course, the idea of a second nuclear arms agreement, SALT II, is now on the table. Okay, those 3 things come together. All of a sudden, huge increase in the number of Soviet Jews being allowed out, reaching the high of 51,000 in 1979. What goes wrong? Soviets invade Afghanistan. Détente dies, Ronald Reagan is elected, and boom, Soviet Jewish immigration again takes a nosedive. Which brings us to the Gorbachev period. Now, it's hard to remember now, but I remember pretty clearly when Gorbachev took over from the old, sick, first doddering Brezhnev, then Andropov was sick and died, and Chernenko was sick and died. And here's this young Mikhail Gorbachev coming in. He's going to get the Soviet Union moving again. Well, after a year, he realizes that he can't do it unless there are huge changes in Russian foreign policy. He's hit by the drop in oil prices down to $10 a barrel in 1986. And then, as now, Moscow depends on oil for a huge amount of its budget. Also, Chernobyl, that's 8% of Soviet electricity gone. So you have that. So finally, Gorbachev realizes, and he makes a critical decision. The critical decision is this. In order to reform the Soviet Union, I must have a peaceful foreign policy. It's got to be a quiet world out there so I can concentrate on domestic reforms. So we have Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement with Reagan in 1987. I should mention Reagan is pushing Star Wars and all these other military expenditures, and the Soviets simply can't keep up. So sign the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. He pulls his troops out of Afghanistan, pressures the Vietnamese to pull their forces out of Cambodia, pulls troops out of Eastern Europe, pulls troops off the border with China, all to create a very positive atmosphere. But again, part of this, and Reagan was very tough on this, you want improved relations with us, said Reagan, you got to do two things. Improve your human rights and stop messing around in the third world. Well, he did this, and in terms of Israel's main enemies at the time, Syria and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Gorbachev told him very bluntly, guys, we're not going to give you arms anymore. You've got to reach an agreement with the Israelis peacefully, politically, and not by war. And of course, he allows hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews to go to Israel, thereby creating this huge community of Soviet Jews, now roughly 20% of the Israeli population. Looking back historically, of all of the Soviet and Russian leaders, Gorbachev, as far as Israel is concerned, was the very best. Security problems, much less for Israel, thanks to Gorbachev, because he's cut aid to Syria, and of course, allowing all the Soviet Jews to leave who wanted to. But as you know, there was a coup against Gorbachev, Soviet Union collapses, and in comes Yeltsin. So again, if you look to page 3 on your study guide here, Yeltsin comes in, initial honeymoon period. I was at the Russian embassy in Tel Aviv for an interview, and I was told at the time, everything was bad with the Soviet Union is good now. That is our foreign policy. Israel was bad, now Israel is good. Very brief honeymoon period. Again, Yeltsin was really worried about domestic reform and the near abroad, that is the countries of the former Soviet Union, how to work out relationships with them. Russian immigration continued, but actually at a much lower level, as many Soviet Jews decided to stay and see what was going to happen in Russia. Unfortunately, due in part to pressure domestically in the Duma or parliament, Yeltsin moved increasingly to the right, became anti-American in his policies by 1985, and began to take an anti-Israeli position as well. However, and I want to emphasize this, unlike the Soviet period, when the Soviets took the anti-Israeli position, Now you had a new phenomenon, which was a very good bilateral relationship between the Israelis and the Soviets. And I've listed some of the areas: trade, tourism, cultural exchanges, even military cooperation. I mean, Israelis and the Russians collaborated on building an AWACS, that is a plane that helped control battle management in the sky, and they sold one to India. They're about to sell one to China until the U.S. vetoed it. So you had this, you had the phenomenon of a Russian satellite broadcasting an Israeli commercial from the atmosphere. You had really good bilateral relations. And culturally, the ties, if you're a Russian artist, you perform in Israel, an Israeli artist, you perform in the Soviet Union. So the bilateral relationship was very good, even as relations politically began to chill. And basically that's continued through the Putin era. When Putin took power in 2000, initially very good relations. He was battling the rebellion in Chechnya, which had moved from a nationalist stage to an Islamic stage. The Israelis were fighting Hamas at the time in the Second Intifada, supported the Russians. The Russians supported Israel at that time against Hamas. So there was close collaboration. Well, that lasted a couple years, and then Putin shifted back to the old traditional Soviet position of backing the Arabs, but at the same time continued the good political relationship with the Israelis bilaterally. In other words, immigration continued, trade continued. You know, at one point, Israel was Russia's second largest trade partner in the Middle East, only after Turkey, and much more than Iran, by the way. Okay, by 2005, from the Israeli-Russian point of view, things had begun to go sour. Even though Putin visited Israel, the first Soviet or Russian leader ever to do so, where he hailed the community of Russian-speaking Jews from the former Soviet Union, as an important bond between Russia and Israel. Nonetheless, he was again arming Syria. He was arming Iran. I don't know if you remember, in the Yeltsin era, there was something called the Gorbachev Agreement, in which the Russians had promised to end all arms sales to Iran once the contracts ran out. Well, Putin nixed that, started selling arms again. Russians were building nuclear reactors for Iran, also missile technology. And the Israeli fear was, the Iranians would develop nuclear-tipped missiles that could hit Israel, as Iran is one of these countries which is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So this was problematic. Then, for those who want to say, well, when did the real clash between the United States and Russia begin? Some go back, well, the Munich conference with Putin's speech in 2007. Actually, it was earlier than that. In 2006, you might remember that in the West Bank and Gaza, there was an election for the Palestine Legislative Council, and Hamas won. Now, Hamas is an organization, Islamic organization, also dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. They shouldn't have been allowed to run. That's another story. Condoleezza Rice is responsible for that. But at the time, the diplomatic quartet of the European Union, the UN, Russia, and the United States all got together and said, no dealings, we'll have no dealings with Hamas unless it recognizes Israel, accepts all previous peace deals that the PLO had signed with Israel, and stops calling for Israel's destruction. 3 weeks later, a Hamas delegation is invited to Moscow, regaled, given a lot of diplomatic legitimacy by the Russians, and Putin says, a big defeat for the United States. So people who were attentive at the time should have seen that as a huge signal as to which direction Putin was going. Now, in 2008, if you remember, Putin and Medvedev switched positions. Putin, though he still had most of the power, became prime minister. Medvedev became the president. And there was an improvement of relations. Basically, the Russians fought Georgia in a brief war, but the Russian drones proved to be very poor. So Israel sold them much improved drones over what they had. And at the same time, the Soviet Medvedev promised to stop the sale of the SAM-300 surface-to-air missiles to Iran. Now, this is a very important thing because if the Israelis are going to bomb the reactors, the surface-to-air missile, the SAM-300s, could very well interfere with an Israeli bombing raid. So this was an important thing, although he said he's postponed it, didn't block the sale totally, but postponed it. Of course, Putin changed that back again in 2015. Okay, 2012, Putin's back and things get worse regionally. He's aiding Syria in the civil war. He's aiding Iran as it develops its nuclear capabilities. But bilateral relations between Israel and Russia continue very well. And Putin makes a visit, his second visit to Israel. I should mention there's a lot of church property. Back from Tsarist times in Jerusalem, Putin wants legitimacy from the Russian Orthodox Church. You've probably seen in the war how much he's getting of it. And he regained church property from the Israelis who turned it over to him. And bilateral relations continued very well until 2015. That's when the Russians intervened militarily in Syria. What happened, and I think everybody here knows, the Assad regime was losing the war. And it took Russian military intervention to change the situation, which it did. The problem was that Iran, an ally of Syria, was using Syrian territory to try to build up bases where they could bomb Israel, close to the Israeli border rather than 700 miles away. The Israelis, in an effort to prevent this, were regularly bombing both Iranian and Hezbollah positions. So what are the Israelis going to do now the Russians are there? And they're there with SAM-300s, they're there with SAM-400s, they're there with Su-35s. It gets a little dangerous for the Israelis to get involved. So Netanyahu, then the prime minister, visits Russia, talks to Putin, and they work out a modus vivendi, whereby the Israelis can continue to bomb the Iranian positions in return for informing the Russians in advance and also promising not to overthrow Assad. And this works. Of course, Netanyahu has to go regularly to Russia to kind of reinforce this, but it works. And finally, we come to the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Israelis are faced with a huge quandary here. What should they do? The U.S., the main ally of Israel, who gives Israel $3.8 billion a year, are urging the Israelis to stop flights to Russia, cut all trade, sanction the oligarchs, etc. But if this happens, then the Israeli leadership is very worried. Then the Russians won't give them freedom of action in Syria and might cut off immigration of Jews from Russia, which has been continuing. So the Israeli government is split on this. Naftali Bennett, who's the prime minister, decides security is most important, provides 22 million tons of humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians, armored buses, field hospital, that kind of thing, but no arms, despite Zelensky's pleading. And the Russians continue to allow the Israelis to overfly Syria and bomb Iranian positions. However, there are lots of discussions and disagreements in the Israeli cabinet. Yair Lapid, who's the foreign minister at the time, says we Israelis have to do what's right, denounces the Russians on a regular basis, making the Russians very, very, very unhappy. Well, the Israeli government falls, and Lapid becomes the interim prime minister until November 22nd elections. The Russians are concerned that Lapid was the most anti-Russian leader in the Israeli government, so they decide to send him a not-so-subtle message. All of a sudden, the Jewish agency, which operates in Russia and is responsible for facilitating the immigration of Russian Jews, is called into court and it may be declared illegal. Well, Lapid gets the message that the Russians are threatening to cut off immigration and does not arm the Ukrainians. Which brings us to the current prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu. Netanyahu takes over in November and is asked, well, what is your policy? Well, he said, well, we're looking at the question of arming the Ukrainians, but after all, we have our own interests, such as, preventing Iran from getting established in Syria. But then something new happens. You would think Netanyahu and Putin are close to being buddy-buddy, but a new development occurs. That is the close relationship that emerges between Iran and Russia. The Iranians provide these drones, which the Russians use to attack Ukraine. Same kind of drones that can be used to attack Israel. And announcement comes that the Russians and Iranians are jointly building a drone factory in Russia for advanced drones. And again, these weapons can be used against Israel as well as Ukraine. So Netanyahu, who has his own domestic problems, as I'm sure everybody here is aware, decides to make small gestures to Ukraine. One gesture is providing an early warning system to Ukrainian cities. So when missiles come in, at least the population is warned, not unlike what the Israelis have along the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. Not weapons, but early warning system. Then Israel allows Lithuania to transfer a battle radar system. Again, no weapons, but it alerts incoming rockets, etc., to frontline troops. Needless to say, the Russians don't like it, and the old anti-Semitism comes out. Just a few days ago, Putin, keeps getting challenged by saying, why do you call the Ukrainians fascists if they've elected a Jew as the president of the country? And then Putin, as Lavrov earlier had said, Lavrov, when asked the same question the previous year, said, well, after all, Hitler had Jewish blood, and some of the worst Jews are the worst anti-Semites. And then Putin comes again and says, well, I know many Jews, and they tell me Zelensky's a lousy Jew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In any case, let me end, before we go to Q&A, with a quotation just 2 days ago from Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, who said the following: nobody but Israel can provide equipment to combat attacks by Iranian drones. We see that Putin, the Kremlin dictator, taking family photos with Iranian leaders. And this Iranian weaponry is being used against us and against you Israelis. I don't know what else is needed. You guys got to give us weaponry to shoot down these drones. And that was 2 days ago, and that's where we stand now. And on that happy note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm open for any Q&A.
The Israeli-Russian relationship seems to be very transactional, and it seems to be based on very short-term calculations, not middle term or long term. It's just sort of can we keep on bombing Syria and not run into the Russians? Is anybody thinking long term in Israel? I mean, and is anybody drawing some of the conclusions that you have drawn?
Again, Ryan, very, very good question. Yes, a number of Israelis have said this is a stupid policy. America is our ally. We should follow the U.S. line. Russia's not our strategic ally. And anyway, the Russians are pulling stuff out of Syria to go fight in Ukraine, so therefore there'll be less of a threat to us. However, remember the old adage, the difference between a politician and a statesman. Politician worries about the next election in the case of Netanyahu just staying in power, whereas a statesman worries about the next generation. And unfortunately, in the Israeli leadership now, we have politicians and not statesmen. Now, as to your first question, I came armed with 4 different theses as to why the Soviets might have helped. The first thesis was, well, Israel back in 47, 48 was very socialist. The Soviets called themselves socialists. So, socialists help socialists. Second thesis was that the Cold War was beginning between the Soviet Union and the United States, UK. And since the British were backing the Arabs, and the US at the time, at least President Truman, was backing Israel, then he could drive a wedge between the UK and the US over that. So that was the second thesis. The third thesis was that the Soviets were busy trying to communize Eastern Europe. And Jews who had survived the Holocaust were coming back to their homes and hopefully regaining their old homes and their own jobs. And that was causing a lot of internal conflict within the countries the Soviets were trying to communize. Therefore, if they could expedite the movement of Jews from Eastern Europe into Palestine/Israel, that would work. And the fourth was the military reason that I gave you. So in this document that I found in the Zionist archives, the guy leads off by saying, your socialism, I know, is not our socialism. And, you have totalitarian socialism on the one hand and sort of democratic socialism on the other. So that was the end of that. I did find some other supporting data in the archives for the other 2 theses. Some of you may remember that during the 45 to 48 period, the British had maintained their blockade on Jewish immigration to Palestine, continuing the old white paper, and the Israelis organized something called the Bricha, or the illegal immigration. And I saw documents saying, my God, we're smuggling these Jews from East Europe and the Soviet troops are helping us. So that sort of gives support for getting the Jews out of East Europe so they could get to Palestine. And then on the third thesis, which was drive a wedge between the US and the UK over Palestine, I did find one document after Gromyko's speech at the UN, where he came out for a 2-state solution effectively for the British mandated Jewish state and an Arab state. The Soviets looked at the Yiddish papers, which were very big in New York at the time, and said, you could have, and told the representatives of the Jewish agency, what you said was right about praising our position, but you could have done it a lot louder than you did it. But I think the real issue was the military one. I mean, you put a few B-29s outside of Baghdad, and they could easily destroy the Iranian, the oil fields in Baku and Azerbaijan. And I think that's what the Soviets were worried about the most.
For the Russian Jewish population, how significant is that now? How significant is immigration from Russia to Israel an issue? How big an issue is that? And do you see that becoming a deciding thing going forward? It sounds like it, as historic in the last 75 years, has been crucial to Israel. Is it going to continue to be crucial?
Well, the questions as to how many Jews there are still in Russia is a very open one. I've seen figures from 250,000 low to 700,000 high. And then people keep coming out of the woodwork and saying they're Jewish. So I think it's still there, but it's more than just that. It's the ethos of the country, which is ingathered Jews from all over the world. And that is an issue. It doesn't make the press here, but I think when Putin, threatened to close down the Jewish agency, that really woke Lapid up and told him, don't arm the Ukrainians. So I think it is still an important issue.
In the movie Fiddler on the Roof, we saw that the king, the Tsar, was carrying out pogroms against Jews in Russia. So our assumption has to be that the king was not so kind to the Jewish population.
The Tsar, yeah.
My question is, after the Russian Revolution, and after all, it was a Jewish man, Karl Marx, who was one of the primary pushers of the Russian Revolution. Did Jewish people participate in that revolution? Did they fight against the king's army, the Tsar's army?
The Jews of Russia were probably, of the 100 so minorities, the most persecuted, and hence had the least stake in the system. So when the revolution took place, there were 5 key leaders. One was Lenin, one was Stalin, one was Kamenev, one was Zinoviev, and one was Trotsky. The last 3 were Jews, but they were anti-Zionists. And a funny story.
They were or were not Zionists?
Anti-Zionists.
Anti.
They were communists who believed that, Zionism is just a means of diverting the working man. And of course, a very funny story on that you might be interested in is when the Balfour Declaration was made by the British in 1917, they thought, you remember, they wanted to get Russia back into the war. The communists had pulled Russia out of the war. They figure they saw the new leadership in Moscow, and they saw Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky. These are Jews, therefore they must be Zionists. Therefore, if we do something nice for them, Balfour Declaration promising help for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, they'll get Russia back in the war. British totally miscalculated because these 3 were anti-Zionists. And the leadership, essentially Stalin purged all the Jews out of the leadership by 1936, killing most of them. Trotsky in 1940 with an axe in Mexico.
The previous times you were here, I asked you a question, and I'm going to ask it again tonight. And you gave me the same answer each of the 4 times.
Okay, we'll see if we can make it 5 in a row.
The question for the 5th time is, what are you recommending as a solution to the current situation in Israel? Each time you answered a 2-state solution. The last time you answered that, I said, yeah, but on the West Bank, which would be the largest part of the alternate state, the settler movement seems to be taking more and more property. There doesn't appear to be enough square acreage for a second state. Are you still looking for a 2-state solution, or do you have other thoughts?
Okay, I'm going to be 5 for 5. A 2-state solution is the only solution. Otherwise, I'll tell you what the alternatives are. Either Israel gives the vote to everybody on the West Bank and Gaza, and they can vote away a Jewish state, or Israel doesn't give them the vote, and the Jews become the minority in an Arab country holding power, and then it begins to look like apartheid. So the solution that I say, only solution, is 2 states. Now, Can you get rid of the settlements? Yes, if there's will. Remember what Sharon did in 2005, got rid of the settlements in Gaza and 4 of the settlements in the West Bank. Now, of course, the current government, with which I strongly disagree, has reinvigorated one of those settlements, much to this displeasure of the United States. But I still think it's possible. I think it's the only solution.
Number one, can you help us understand what's going on in Israel today regarding, I think it's their Supreme Court? How is that likely to play out? And the second question, draws on your comment of the distinction between a politician and a statesman. Looking a generation out, how does Israel look a generation out?
All right, I'm going to answer your second question. These are wonderful questions. I'm going to answer the second question first. If this government stays in power for its full 4-year term, there are going to be real problems. It's going to alienate American Jews. It's going to alienate the United States. So the future, if they stay in power, which is a really open question, is bleak. Okay, I figured somebody would ask me the question about judicial reform. So I just wanted to be sure I had it right. So I wrote it down just to be sure, because it's a bit of a complex situation. There are 4 parts to the judicial reform that we see. Number 1 is taking a Supreme Court decision, because the Supreme Court in Israel has the power to veto a decision by Parliament or even the government if it thinks it's wrong. So first part of the judicial reform is only having 61 seats in Parliament to overrule a Supreme Court decision, 61 of 120, bare minimum. And that's strongly opposed by the majority of the population. The second part of the judicial reform is changing the system of selecting judges. Now, this is a little technical, so please bear with me. The current system for selecting judges, including Supreme Court justices, is a committee of 9, made up of 2 cabinet ministers, 2 members of the Israeli parliament, 3 Supreme Court justices, and 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association. Now, the judicial reform wants to change it, keeping 3 judges, but having the justice minister, 2 ministers selected by the government, and 3 Knesset or parliament members of the ruling coalition, which gives the power to the ruling government, and they can choose their own judges, essentially. So that's the second part. The third question is on reasonableness. Now, that sounds a little strange, maybe, reasonableness. But let me give you an example of how the Supreme Court answered the reasonableness question and actually forced a change in Israeli policy. As you know, along the Gaza Strip, there are a group of Jewish villages and towns. And when fighting started with Hamas in Gaza firing rockets, the government decided it would fortify 1 room in each of the schools. So if they hear the rockets are coming, all the kids would run to that fortified room. The people who lived along the border said, hey, that's not reasonable. We're not going to our kids aren't going to make it in time. You should fortify all of the classrooms because it's not reasonable to only do 1. Well, in fact, that's what the Supreme Court forced the government to do. So in schools, all of the rooms are reinforced. And they want to change that and get rid of this reasonableness thing. And the fourth part of this is the police minister, who is a Kahanist, a far, far right guy, wants to be empowered now to imprison somebody who he thinks is against the interests of Israel or is a threat to the public interest. Now, he says he's doing this because there's been a rise of crime in the Arab community of Israel. But in fact, if this law goes through, he could throw any of the political opponents in jail. So this is what's going on. But since you've asked the question, I can't resist. What's been happening over the last week? Well, remember the Bar Association, which the current government wants to eliminate for the choosing of ministers. Netanyahu thought because there's so much opposition to this, he'd do an end run. So he ran his own guy for head of the Israeli Bar Association, who supports the judicial reform. Lost overwhelmingly to somebody who opposes the judicial reform. Then there's a vote in the Knesset or parliament for who's going to be the parliamentary representatives on this committee. And of course, Netanyahu totally messed that one up. He has the 64-56, majority in the parliament, but he sent unclear signals. So the end result was a member of the opposition won the vote 58-53. So he's now trying to set up a separate bar commission. So, but to answer your question, that's what judicial reform is all about. And that's why hundreds of thousands of Israelis are taking to the streets to try to prevent it. Well, if he tries to do it again, which he says he's going to do this week, then you're going to have one of two things. One, hundreds of thousands of Jews will come out again next Saturday night and the Saturday night afterwards. But if he tries to push it through, then you run into the risk of a general strike, which means closing down the airport, closing down the ports, and that could bring down the government.
What should Israel's diplomacy be relative to the Ukraine situation? Supply defense arms to EU members and close their eyes when these are transferred to Ukraine? Second part of the question, what is the U.S. advising Israel?
The U.S. is advising Israel, as we know from the leaked documents, for that airman in Massachusetts to go arm the Ukrainians, assuming the leaked document is correct, which I think it was. My own feeling is that I think at this point, the Israelis, well, even this battlefield radar was transferred from Lithuania to Ukraine. And it couldn't have been transferred unless the Israelis agreed to it. So what is an interesting thing going on now is the Israelis have old Merkava tanks. They're good tanks, but they're old. Apparently, they're now being shipped to at least several countries in Europe to make up for the Leopard tanks that are being given to Ukraine. So that's the current dynamic. My own feeling is there are weapon systems such as the Barak anti-missile system that could be used to shoot down rockets. But Netanyahu is so far enmeshed in the current domestic problems. I don't even know if he has time to think about this seriously. That's what I'm worried about.
I would like your comments on going back to post-World War II, when Israel was created and the Russians were allies against the Germans. And Israel was created as a refuge for the Germans who'd been persecuted. My question is, and I'd like to hear your comment on, why have the borders of Israel changed?
First of all, in 1948, everybody was operating on the UN partition decision. UN partition decision gave the Negev or the south to Israel, but most of the Galilee, the northern part, to what should have been an Arab state. However, when the Arab countries invaded Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, Syria and Lebanon from the north, it totally changed the picture. And you had a number of the Palestinians living in this area leave. Now, they left for three reasons. In some cases, they were kicked out by the Israelis. In some cases, they were told to get out of the way so the Arab armies could come in. But to my mind, at least, having looked at this, they were in a wartime situation. If you can get out of the way and maybe come back later, you can. And most of them left because of fear of what was going to happen in the war. Mm-hmm. So the end result was in the Galilee, many of the Arabs had left. There had been an invasion before the Arabs invaded by an Arab sort of mercenary force to help the Palestinians. They lost, and they came back and tried again in September of 48. And they lost a second time, and a lot of the Arabs simply left as a result of that. So the change in the border was that Israel, instead of having just a piece of the Galilee, wound up with most of the Galilee, the area in the north.
Was that fair?
Well, you know, if you're invaded and you lose, if you are the invaders and you lose the war, basically tough. You know, there are consequences when you start a war and lose it, as hopefully Mr. Putin will learn in the near future. But that's a matter we can talk about.
Thank you.
You described in the paper that underlies your presentation the Israeli-Russian relationship as one of a junior partner in what appears to be a one-sided relationship, which chiefly benefits Russia. What would you say is the single most cogent reason why Israel has this relationship and continues it?
Well, again, that's a $64 question. I asked precisely, Roy, your question when I went to the Israeli Foreign Ministry a few years ago. At that time, Avigdor Lieberman was the foreign minister, and Lieberman was saying, oh, Russia's our strategic ally. And I said, wait a minute. And I asked the Israeli diplomat at the foreign ministry, how can he say this? They're arming Iran, they're arming Syria, et cetera. How can they be a strategic ally? The answer I got, they could do worse things. And it's a question of what kind of weapon systems which they supply to the Arabs. And on a couple occasions, they were persuaded by the Israelis not to supply even more sophisticated weapons, such as the SAM 300s they had promised to Syria. Then they canceled the promise. Then in 2018, they wound up giving it to them again.
So I want to thank you really sincerely. I think it was all-encompassing, and maybe there's a lot of dates that you might want to look up. I really recommend the paper because it lays everything out in a very, very thoughtful and systematic way. Thank you so much for speaking tonight.
Thank you.